Emerging from the two largest mass conflicts the world had ever seen, the atomic bomb detonations in Hiroshima and Nagasaki felt like a full stop. The world could never see such death, such destruction ever again. But this was only the beginning. As Britain moved to cement itself as one of the world's emerging nuclear powers, there was also a move to protect and survive. Today, we step inside a bunker built to house the UK government in the event of a nuclear attack. Welcome to the secret nuclear bunker. Today we're in Kelvedon Hatch, nestled in the Essex countryside around 20 miles northeast of the centre of London as the crow flies. The land here has been farmed by the Parish family for generations. And you'd be mistaken for thinking that the bungalow here was the farmhouse. But not many farmhouses have an 18-inch thick reinforced concrete ceiling hidden beneath a false roof. Also shielded from view, steel shutters and bomb-proof doors. In fact, the whole building is a shell. In 1952, the government requisitioned 25 acres of land from Jim Parish, bulldozed the hill, which once stood here, and what they built was far more than the facade of a farmhouse. They constructed a home for central government in the event of a nuclear attack. Let's take a look inside. Hi Mike, how are you doing?
Nice to see you.
So nice to meet you. So in 1952, the government bought the land from your grandparents to build this secret bunker. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
We farm some 2,000 acres here. I'm the fifth generation. My son who does the farming now is the sixth. And in 1952, the government approached my grandfather and father, and under the threat of compulsory purchase, wanted to obtain this 25 acres that the bunker is hidden under.
So how do you think Jim Parish, your grandfather, felt about this? Was it a sense of duty or was there some level of irritation to it?
Well, he'd fought 2 world wars, so he didn't really want to fight a third, was his sort of main object in life. Like all farmers, he wasn't very pleased that he was going to be losing 25 acres of productive land. But needs must, and in time of war, you can't beat a government.
How do you go about building a 3-storey secret bunker without people noticing?
A lot easier in 1952.
Right, okay.
The village of Kelvedon Hatch was a mere 150 odd souls, not the 4,500 metropolis that it is now. Little country lanes, so there were no telephones to speak of, so it was much easier to keep things quiet. We did as we were told also in 1952. If the government said jump, you jumped. Right. So it was much easier. So yeah, they were able to build it. They told the locals that it was being built as an underground water reservoir, and they bought some of the building materials in on the train. And so they told the lorry drivers not to come straight here, because of course it would be fairly obvious, and they were to go and drive around the little villages before they sort of got here.
Wow.
And there was one lovely little story that one of these lorries had driven a neighbouring village, and he was lost. And he saw an old boy there with his sickle cutting the hedge, and so he stopped, going to try and discreetly ask where the bunker was. And before he'd even said a word, the chap doing the hedge said, "I reckon you're lost. You're looking for that bunker, aren't you? If you just go down there." So although the powers that be thought they were building it, obviously in secrecy, in actual fact, those locally knew exactly what was going on.
Right, okay. And do you think your grandfather, he would have been allowed to sneak in if there had been an attack? Could he have been given a bed in the bunker?
Definitely not.
Right.
Absolutely, definitely not. I farmed over it all my life, and never once did I get in to see. They just guarded it and kept it very, very quiet. My father got in though. He got in the early days when it was under the RAF.
Well, tell us a little bit more about exactly where we are today in this tunnel.
This 120-yard long tunnel goes into the bottom of the hill, which is obviously where the bunker is, hidden by the hill. So you have to go all the way down here and through the blast doors before you can get into the bunker itself proper.
Would you like to give me a tour?
I would love to give you a tour.
Oh, thank you.
Again, man's ingenuity has written a flaming chapter across the sky for all the world to see. Whether this mighty force we have unleashed will be for evil, or whether it will be harnessed for peace and good, time alone will tell.
In the 1920s, Churchill mused on the idea of a bomb no bigger than an orange, powerful enough to blast a township at a stroke, to press a button and destroy a whole city. By the early stages of the Second World War, Britain was moving towards creating such a weapon, developing the tube alloys program with Canada. Then the entire endeavour was subsumed by the US's Manhattan Project. As the war concluded, Churchill was voted out of power, making way for Clement Attlee's Labour government. Although the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan under Attlee's watch, less than a fortnight after he had been elected, Churchill stated in Parliament on the 16th of August 1945, "The decision to use the atomic bomb was taken by President Truman and myself. Britain had voted for reform, for a new Britain under Attlee and Labour as the shadow of the war lifted. But with the seeds of the Cold War already sown, an atmosphere of fear began to grow."
A weather plane reports from Hiroshima that conditions are good. At 9:15, the bomb is dropped.
It was like letting the genie out of the bottle. Once the atomic bomb was born, science just kept rampaging on and on and on. And of course, it was allowed to keep going on because of the very nature of the Cold War. You had to keep one step ahead of your enemy. So the atomic bomb wasn't good enough any longer. We had to invent the hydrogen bomb. The atomic bomb in Hiroshima was about 20 kilotons. But the hydrogen bomb, those can be as big as the scientist wishes to make it. It can be up to, say, 1,000 times more powerful. It could be even more, but then the bomb could be so massive and so terrifying and so dangerous that it can't be launched, can't be used in war. It would only ever be useful as a psychological tool. So you had to keep clawing your way up the nuclear ladder to ever more terrifying weapons.
Well, you just come down the 120-yard long tunnel and you'll see that it's got a dogleg here. So if the blast had managed to get through the end doors there, it would come down here, hit this wall and go back before it turned the dogleg, hit the wall at the end there and come back and put far less pressure on the doors.
Wow.
Also, you can see that you could easily defend the tunnel here. So if people like you and me had managed to break in, then obviously we could be sorted out as we ran down the tunnel.
Yikes.
These blast doors here obviously are the entrance to the bunker, and once these doors are shut, well, of course you're locked in there for 3 months.
And how heavy are these?
The doors weigh about the same as a family car.
People in ordinary households were told to remain under cover for 14 days. That's the estimated guess at which radiation reduces to a tolerable level. But the bunkers, you would be in for, I've seen it written as 30 days, could be as much as 3 months. It depends on a lot of things. It depends what your radiation level is like outside. You'll have instruments at the bunker, of course, measuring the outside air. So if your level is still sky high, then you've got no choice, you have to stay in. Levels of water and food and the fuel in your generator, they also determine how long you can stay in the bunker for. It's certainly no longer than 3 months, because then you're allowing potential anarchy and other leaders to ascend in your absence. You can't stay too long. You still do need to have that horrible moment where you crank the door open and emerge and face the hell outside.
So we're now at the lowest point in the bunker. Could you tell us about the thickness of the walls and how they create a Faraday cage?
Well, this is the heart of the bunker, you're quite right. The bunker itself has got 10-foot thick reinforced walls, and round it is a mesh, which is called a Faraday cage, and that's to stop the electromagnetic pulse caused by the explosion of the bomb from interfering with the electronic equipment down here.
So this was first a rotor station, am I right?
Correct, this was a rotor station. This is the plotting floor. Here you had the WAF round it, who were moving the things to show where fighters were and where the Russian bears were, because all the time they were knocking on the door to see how quickly we would react. And of course we had to react because they may or may not have been carrying an atomic bomb. That information was then sent to the airfields, and the aircraft would laboriously take off and go and intercept the Russians. We actually couldn't fly high enough for the Russian bears, so we had to rely on the Americans. to go and do it for us until we got the lightnings. Once we got the lightnings at Northfield, then we were able to do it ourselves. So in its first life, there was a hole in the ceiling here. All round this ceiling, there were glass cabins with the great and the good looking down at this big plotting floor, which was between these 4 pillars, and moving their counters to show where the threat came from.
So there'd be people watching above?
Indeed so, yes.
The Second World War dictated a lot of civil defence policy in Britain. I think of it as almost a kind of sentimental thing. The knowledge that we got through the Blitz and that we triumphed in the Second World War, I think that gave people a sense of hope and optimism, and that's carried over into the Cold War. And that worked to an extent once we were in the atomic age, but once we were in the hydrogen bomb age, the thermonuclear age, everything changed. And the idea that Blitz civil defence measures, such as an Anderson shelter at the bottom of the garden, those little shelters wasn't even strong enough to withstand a direct hit from a conventional bomb. The knowledge that those things could help, that was just completely quashed by the hydrogen bomb. And the government knew that too, which is why they had no public shelters at all for the population. There were often calls to have public shelters, but these were always batted away. There wasn't enough money in all the world for bunkers for everyone, but also utterly pointless, which the government were less willing to admit to, of course. But they did build shelters for themselves. They did build bunkers all over the country. Some of them were left over from the Second World War, and they were then fortified or strengthened in some way. Others were purpose-built for the nuclear age. But even then, a bunker cannot save you in the nuclear age. It can save you from fallout, and it can save you if you're a nice distance away from it. But in terms of a direct hit or being in amongst the action, nothing can help you at all.
So after it was a rotor station, it became something else. Tell us a little bit more about its second life.
Okay, well, the second life we became a regional government headquarters 5.2, to give it its official title. We had invented radar. We gave our radar secrets to the Americans, and they invented the Type 88 radar, which pretty much does what radar does now. It's all one thing on one screen. It meant you no longer needed the plotting floors. They moved the radar away to airfields so that we could scramble our aircraft up much quicker to intercept the Russian bears, and so this became defunct. And so that's why then it was then converted into a regional government headquarters, which is civilian, and it would have allocated surviving resources to those of us that had managed to survive and govern, of course, this area. It is the London bunker. It would have governed London.
In October of 1962, the Cold War jolted decisively into action. There was a 13-day standoff between the US and the USSR over the installation of Soviet missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles away from the American mainland. Although tensions rapidly faded, the threat posed by the Cuban Missile Crisis hung over the world for the remainder of the Cold War.
During the Second World War, the government actually had a mix of dispersal, fleeing the capital, and remaining in the heart of the capital. So Churchill famously stayed in the capital, as did the royal family, mainly for morale purposes. Certainly with the royals, that was for morale. In the Cold War, again, we tried to continue along that line. So there were what were known as citadels in London, huge fortified bunkers. But it was quickly realised that these aren't going to be any good because an atomic bomb will take them out. And so thoughts turned to, reluctantly I think, dispersal. We have to get out of the city. We have to get out of the target area. Central government had a plan to escape to a huge bunker in Wiltshire, and the Prime Minister would have been taken there at the very last minute by helicopter. That was the plan, at least. But it soon became realised or suspected that the Russians knew of this bunker's location. And they also realised that if there was a terrible crisis and they had to man the bunker and then were able to stand down and the crisis was averted, as with Cuba, then you've given the game away. Your enemy knows where it is, so you can only use this bunker once.
Although Kelvedon Hatch was intended to be the home of the British government in the event of a nuclear attack, they would in effect become a regional government. The whole of the country would be divided up into smaller regions, each presided over by a different bunker.
So there were lots of flaws popping up in the idea of fleeing to the bunker in Wiltshire, and the government changed that to what they called the Python plan, which was, let's break central government up into lots of tiny small groups. We will have bunkers in every region. They cut Britain up into civil defence regions. Every region would have a bunker of its own, or planned to. Again, money was always confining us. And each of these bunkers would have a minister in charge, who would be the controller, if you like. And after nuclear war, he would retreat to that bunker and he would manage and run and operate and potentially terrify his little patch of Britain.
So this would have been the heart of the regional government. Tell us a bit more about this room.
The country was split into 18 regions, and so this is the London bunker, this is the London region that we would have governed. And so as you see around the wall, there are all the departments of state that would have been represented by about 3 people. Just shows you don't need so many civil servants these days when it can be run without it. And they would have, yes, governed their particular section and given the commissioner advice, as they do now, give it to the Prime Minister.
And do you remember anything from this room when it was operational?
No, I never came down here when it was operational. The only thing I remember, because of course the guards were here stopping us getting in, but we did farm over the top, is when they held the regular exercises down here, particularly the 5-day one. The horrible smell of rotting cabbage that came out the air vents, and that was the thing that I most sort of remembered.
Tell me, have any famous people visited this room or this bunker? I heard that Thatcher might have been here at one point?
Yeah, you mean more famous than me? Yeah, you're absolutely right. Margaret Thatcher's bodyguard actually lived locally, and he told us that Margaret Thatcher had come down here. I've no doubt at all that other Prime Ministers did. This is the London bunker, it's the one nearest to London, and so you would expect when they were being briefed, they'd have been shown somewhere like this. And yes, we had the Duke of Edinburgh come down here. Again, I suspect just as a briefing.
After nuclear war, you've got a whole list of problems, of course, but one of the main problems for government is law and order. It's all your plans to set up feeding centres, welfare centres, health centres. It's all pointless if there's anarchy and no one is following the rules that you've set out, abiding by the plans that you've made. So there must be law and order. There's no prospect of jail anymore, no prospect of fines. These ordinary punishments simply don't work. They've got no teeth anymore after the nuclear war. Because after nuclear war, jail might actually be a luxury, because a jail is a fortified, secure building where you have a bed and they're obliged to feed you. That sounds like heaven after nuclear war. And so that's why the authorities would have to be imaginative and think up new punishments. And of course the most obvious is capital punishment, bringing back execution. But another method of punishment, and it's one which makes us think of medieval times, is to bring back the prospect of public humiliation, parading someone in the public square by putting them in the stocks. I've seen it referred to in the documents as subjecting the offender to public disapproval. And now that could mean anything, of course. It might mean pelting them with rotten fruit, but you wouldn't want to waste the fruit in these times, would you? You'd have to eat the fruit. The British government didn't say bluntly what it would be. The sentence was left to the imagination, which makes it all the more sinister. But they could also maintain law and order by rewarding good behaviour and manual labour with food. The government would have stockpiled lots of food and kept it in what were known as buffer depots across the country. And that system dates from the Second World War. These regional bunkers were about administering life for civilians, organising civilians, getting healthcare back on the go, organising labour crews to clear the rubble and dispose of the bodies. And your reward, of course, would have been food, because you can't be rewarded with wages because there's nothing to spend it on. So food is the only reward, food and shelter. So therefore, the flip side of that is a punishment can be the withholding of food. So food becomes of prime importance. If you had to get supplies which had to be kept refrigerated, I found this in the archives. They asked, well, how can we get this across? How can we get supplies and medicines to people that have to be refrigerated? How do we physically transport them? And one idea was to pile them into old ice cream vans, because they, of course, have refrigerated compartments. So the idea was you would pile your ice cream vans filled with medicine, And I assume you wouldn't turn on the chimes, but nonetheless you would go bumping across the rubble-strewn roadways to the feeding centres and to the medical centres. But again, it just sounds so ludicrous to have it delivered by a van with, Mickey Mouse or Snow White on the side. But ludicrous, that sums up the whole idea of planning to survive a nuclear war. It's ludicrous.
So tell me a bit about this dormitory and the hotbed system.
Well, this is the top floor of the bunker, and it's where the living accommodation is. There's more than this one dormitory. There's lots of dormitories. They had 450 people down here, of which a third went to sleep at any one time, and they hadn't got room to have a bed for all 450. So they used the hotbed system. They were each issued with a sheet that was stitched rather like a sleeping bag, stitched down one side, and that was their personal sheet. And so that's what they got in the hotbed with. So one man got out, you got in the nice hotbed.
And tell me, have you ever stayed here yourself, or?
Many times.
Really?
Many times, yes. We have paranormals and scout groups that stay the night, and so I have to stay here to make sure there's somebody on site.
And presumably you don't use the hotbed system for yourself?
Absolutely. I have my own little room.
Good, so you should.
So most of the people who would have been manning these bunkers wouldn't have known about it until the dreaded day when they were handed a letter with their wartime instructions. It would tell them that they'd been chosen for wartime service at a certain location. They'd been instructed to go home, to pack a bag. Often these letters said things which are quite quaint, like pack some pocket money and bring some chocolate biscuits and a book because facilities for entertainment will be limited. I believe that's how they phrased it. So you have to go home and pack your pocket money and your chocolate biscuits and then come back to the office, and then you will all be transported to your chosen bunker. But of course the most important thing was it was only you, the designated civil servant or engineer or scientist. You certainly couldn't take any family. Space in those bunkers was already exceedingly tight. Kelvedon Hatch, for example, had bunk space set up in its corridors and in its entrance tunnel. That shows how tight space was. So you certainly couldn't bring the wife and kids along. And that raises the question, well, is this civil servant going to comply then? At this dreadful, terrifying period, is he going to abandon his family? We simply don't know. So when these lists are being drawn up, they always had to factor in the knowledge that the allocated staff might not turn up, or you might get a fraction of them, or they might turn up with, their 5 kids in tow saying, if you don't take the kids, I'm not coming in. So there could be chaos. Another reason why you can't properly prepare and plan for a nuclear war.
The bunker was built for 600 people to live for up to 3 months. But what would it be like living underground for so long, cut off from the world?
A lot of Britain's plans for nuclear war were borrowed and recycled from the Blitz, but one that we couldn't borrow was long-term dwelling in a bunker. Because of course during the Blitz the worst you would have to endure would be overnight down in the underground, for example, but there was always the prospect of fresh air and sunlight the next day. But in a nuclear war you're talking about remaining undercover for at least a fortnight. So there were studies done, quite a few psychological studies, to see how we would react. There was a famous experiment done to try and partially recreate this, where 3 female volunteers in York, it was known as the York experiment, in the 60s, they went into a mocked-up fallout shelter and they kept diaries and reported back what their experience was like. And the biggest and most enervating thing was terrible lethargy. It wasn't panic, it wasn't boredom, it wasn't irritability and bickering with one another. It was a terrible, dragging lethargy. So that's how we think we would survive. We would react to being confined for that amount of time. A terrible lethargy.
So Mike, tell us where we are now.
Well, you're in the sick bay, and so you're locked in here. You would obviously expect people, if there's 450 of you, to get the same sort of illnesses and diseases that we get out in the population now. And of course radiation sickness might have been one of those things that you got, because even though this is under positive pressure, blowing the radiation out all the time, obviously you may have caught it from some other way. So they wouldn't have done major surgery here. They can't do major surgery. It's only a sort of a sick bay type thing. And so it would have been fairly rudimentary, I think. If you died, well, we've got cardboard coffins and we've also got body bags. You can only leave a body in a body bag for about 3 days because we bloat and all the gases, and then eventually you explode. And so you would need to get the body out the back door before that happened and chuck it outside, probably with a little tag on its thing, which is what the civilian population had to do as well.
So a name and
yeah, an address or whatever.
very morbid,
In
isn't it?
practice, of course, it wouldn't, because if you've got that level of radiation, nothing would happen. But you know, hope to the population.
The food supplies that you would have in your bunker depend on the size of your bunker. So the very smallest bunkers, which we had in Britain, the ROC monitoring post, they'd have had ration packs because space, it was basically just one room underground. But the larger bunkers, they would have had kitchens and canteens. So they would have had, obviously, tinned food. Tinned food is always the best one because you can easily store it. It doesn't go off. You would also have had lots of biscuits and, importantly, boiled sweets, because they were good at delivering a sugar hit and therefore giving energy. But then someone, and I found this in the archives, it's quite funny, they said that boiled sweets might actually be a bad idea, because if you're stuck in a shelter for 30 days and you're continually sucking on a boiled sweet, it might irritate the roof of your mouth. With those sharp, jagged sweets could tear at the roof of your mouth. And the thinking was, why add even more pain and misery onto this burdened population?
So we're in one of 3 bedrooms that seem substantially bigger and more spacious than anything in the dormitories. Who would be in here?
This is rather a special room because 450 people, it would be very, very hectic. And so these 3 were very lucky. It's their bedrooms, it's their offices. And the reason that they're here is because they've got to be on duty 24 hours a day. The commissioner, he would have been a cabinet minister. He has the far room. The middle room is by his principal officer, who would have been an ordinary minister or a senior civil servant. And the prime minister would have had this room here.
Wow, this is the prime minister's room.
Prime minister's room, yeah. The commissioner, he had a very onerous job. He had the power of life and death over people. He would shoot looters. He would be engaging in euthanasia, I suspect.
Sorry, you mentioned euthanasia. So what do you mean by that, and in what context would that be happening?
Once the bomb has gone off, you've got temperatures of minus 50, 60 degrees. It's very cold, no sun, marauding gangs. Those who've got radiation sickness, you've got no sanction against them because they know they're going to die anyway. No good saying I'm going to lock you up. You can't lock them up anyway because there's no jails. You've got no hospitals, so you can't treat anybody. And so there's going to be, like way back in the wars, you put people out of their misery if they obviously weren't going to live and they were suffering.
There's a theory that the Prime Minister wouldn't be in any bunker because he would be vaporised, because the idea would be that he stays in London till the very last moment and so therefore might not have made it out of London. And so that's why, of course, he would have nominated deputies to take over if the worst happened to him. He might have been part of the Python dispersal plan, which is take your experts of central government, break them up into small groups and disperse them around the country. The same goes for the Queen. People often wonder what would have happened to the Queen in nuclear war. There is a theory that she would have been scooted out of central London by plane. Some people like the idea that the big wide tree-lined walkways in London parks are kept that way so that a plane might taxi along and scoot the Queen to safety. But in reality, she would probably have been on a dingy old car ferry in one of the Scottish sea lochs. And that's because under the Python plan, the Caledonia McBrain Ferry Company in Scotland built 3 which were fortified as basically floating nuclear bunkers. And when these were decommissioned at the end of the Cold War, one of them was kitted out as a luxury cruise liner called the Hebridean Princess. And if you look at their website, it currently bears the royal crest because the Queen is one of their regular passengers. But they've all been stripped of their nuclear features. I have inquired with the company, so not very luxurious, but at least she would have been in a sea loch and of course mobile. If you're in a floating nuclear bunker, the benefit is that you can move and escape any fallout plume that might be drifting towards you.
One of the biggest challenges for the government throughout the Cold War was judging how to keep the public informed. Should information and advice be public in case of an attack, or would this create mass hysteria? Would it be better to release information in the event of attack, or would that be too late? In 1980, there was much speculation about the now infamous Protect and Survive pamphlet.
Well, if nuclear war was drawing near, if the government had assessed through their expertise that it was inevitable, that it was coming, we would have entered what they would have called the precautionary stage, and that's when certain plans would have escalated, one of which would have been the dissemination of public information advice. The most famous one, of course, is the early 1980s campaign, Protect and Survive. It was often ridiculed because it implies that even if you're in a target area, in a city, you can survive it just with household objects, which of course is ludicrous. It came to public attention in the early 80s when a few clips from the films were leaked to Panorama and Jeremy Paxman broadcast them. And Jeremy Paxman introduces it with the very frightening phrase that these videos will not be shown again. He's showing them now. They will not be shown again until nuclear war is imminent. And that always frightened me. He didn't say unless or if. He said they won't be shown again until it happens. And people then began asking the government, what is this thing? Some people accused Leon Britton, who was in charge of it at the time, of trying to keep it secret. And he just said, and I agree with him on this, we're not trying to keep it secret. We haven't dished it out to you because we're not at that stage. Nuclear war, thankfully, isn't on the doorstep. So therefore we haven't printed the thing and sent it out to you. And the thinking was that if they had printed it out and posted it to every household without a nuclear threat being hanging over us, people would say, oh, more junk mail, and they'd shove it to the back of the kitchen drawer and they'd forget all about it. It wouldn't have the terrifying impact which it needed to have in order to make us all sit up and pay attention.
In May of 1980, the government was forced to publish Protect and Survive. The accompanying films, which were only intended to be broadcast 72 hours prior to an attack, if indeed the government was to have this amount of warning, calmly informed the British public how to prepare for the apocalypse. The films outlined how to build a shelter in your own home, gather supplies, how much water you'd need, and even how to dispose of a body. Though their main aim was to keep everybody at home, to stop them seeking refuge elsewhere. So, Mike, where are we? Because it looks to me like we're in a BBC radio studio.
It is indeed. It's a BBC radio station. And it's connected to the national network. And it's from here that the Prime Minister would have been able to broadcast to the nation. It's where attack warnings would have been issued and advice to the population as to where the government food stores were, perhaps, what they were doing about help and succour to rescue you because you're stuck under your stairs and you've been there for 2 months and there's no let up. And what you want is to know there is hope.
Wow, so really advice for the population on how to protect and survive.
Oh yeah, they weren't doing desert island discs here. No, this would have purely been on a war footing, and so the broadcasts would have probably been at a set time because, of course, there's no radios out there. You've got your transistor radio, and you're not going to switch it on for a little while because the batteries won't last forever. Wow. And so it would be at a particular time. There would be a broadcast that would tell you what was pertinent at the time.
Mm. And do you think that people would have listened to those instructions and those guidelines at the time?
If you were under your stairs in the cupboard and you'd been there for a month and you'd got no more food left, I think you'd be avidly listening to know whether the radiation had moved on, whether there was any hope of food coming to you, what they were doing with all the dead bodies that were littering the streets. Was anybody going to clear the roads? What about the big fire that's still raging throughout London? I think you'd want to know that. So I think the population would listen avidly.
Yeah, yes. Sounds like you'd be glued to it. So the BBC knew about this, so there must have been people outside of the government who knew about the secret bunker.
Oh, absolutely, because bunkers have to be manned.
So it doesn't sound so much secret. There's obviously people that were in on it. How could they ensure that, the cat didn't get out of the bag?
Absolutely. They'd have signed the Secrecy Act. And although it's sort of a voluntary thing, It's amazing how people do keep to it. I know when we took over the bunker, the guard wouldn't tell us where things were. We had to find it ourselves, and then once we'd found it, he would confirm it, rather than just telling, yeah, it's there.
So, can you tell us a little bit about how the bunkers would communicate with each other?
Lots of ways. Telephones, telexes, radio, and to make sure that they were able to do so, they had what they nicknamed the chicken wire system. And if you wanted to talk from Horsham up to, say, Carlisle, well, you'd do so via Coventry. But if a bomb had gone off on Coventry, as you could see, you could just work your way round, so you could still talk to the other bunkers. The country was littered with bunkers, obviously from regional government headquarters right the way down to the borough councils at the lower end, who were underneath a billiard table somewhere in the town hall. So they needed to communicate all of those, because of course they were the ones that were allocating surviving resources to us and trying to get us out of the muddle that we were in.
Wow, it seems like quite a complicated and sophisticated system, but I can see here Berners-Lee. Does that have anything to do with Tim Berners-Lee, the developer of the World Wide Web?
Indeed, they happen to know my aunt. He came and visited here on the anniversary of the World Wide Web, and this was the basis of the World Wide Web. That's why we were able to get it up and running so quickly.
So the system of communication between the bunkers is literally linked to how the internet was rolled out?
Absolutely. If you remember,
Wow.
in the beginning of time, the internet was all done on telephone wires. We didn't have optic fibre and things like that. And so this is already your telephone wire system throughout the whole country. And indeed the world, which meant it was easy just to tap into it, and away you went.
Wow, that's quite remarkable.
Nice little bit of history.
By the 1980s, the fear of nuclear Armageddon was firmly wedged in public imagination. Raymond Briggs' 1982 graphic novel, When the Wind Blows, and its subsequent film adaptation, saw a retired couple take a pamphlet from their local library, build a fallout shelter, and attempt to survive the nuclear devastation unfolding outside their four walls. Mick Jackson's 1984 film Threads gave an unremittingly bleak portrait of a nuclear attack and the struggle to survive in its aftermath.
I first became obsessed with the Cold War at the age of 3. I was only a tender, tiny toddler, and my dad put on the BBC, the notorious BBC film Threads, and I watched that as a 3-year-old, and the images in that film seared into my brain and have stuck with me forever and have set the path in my life, absolutely. It's all down to a low-budget BBC film from 1984.
As fear of a nuclear strike continued to play on the world's collective consciousness, the Cold War itself was grinding to a halt.
The Cold War, of course, came to an end at the end of the 1980s, which is quite funny because at the beginning of the decade it was at its most terrifying peak with the arrival of cruise missiles. And perhaps it was because it was so frightening that it goaded people to speak, to sit down and say this has to end. And so we had the famous scenes of Reagan and Gorbachev speaking by the fireside, speaking like friends, not as opponents of two great empires or opposing ideologies. They seemed jovial almost. It was so strange. When that eventually happened, that seemed to tip us towards the end of the Cold War.
By the mid-1980s, Gorbachev came to the realization that the Soviet Union would never match the US's spending on nuclear weapons. After the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, he moved to significantly reform the USSR. Meetings with Reagan were often heated, but eventually led to a deceleration in Cold War tensions. The USSR was opening up, and by 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Just over 2 years later, the Soviet Union, facing growing unrest in Eastern Europe, still reeling from their defeat in Afghanistan, and with mounting economic problems, collapsed in December 1991. The Cold War was over. Bizarrely, a year after this, there were still guards based at Kelvedon Hatch. In fact, The Kelvedon Hatch bunker was only decommissioned in December 1994, a full 3 years after the end of the Cold War.
The end of the Cold War meant that we no longer needed, of course, our nuclear bunkers, and one by one they gradually were decommissioned. It didn't happen all at once because there was no immediate and obvious end to the Cold War. It petered out. You know, historians even today still argue about when the Cold War started and when it ended. We always think of the Berlin Wall falling as the end of the Cold War, but then the Soviet Union was still around until 91. One by one the bunkers were decommissioned, just as gradually all our sirens were dismantled and taken down. When the bunkers were decommissioned, some were just left to ruin. You can't knock these bunkers down because they are very, very sturdy. They're built to endure a nuclear war. And so a lot of them have found different uses. Some of them, such as Kelvedon Hatch, have become museums, and some were put to more creative uses. I've seen some of the smaller ROC bunkers set up as wine cellars. I've even read of one tiny ROC monitoring post which is used by a birdwatcher, and he can crouch in the hatch and just neatly peep over the top to watch the birds. So there was no one moment where all the bunkers and all the sirens just vanished from the landscape. It just happened piecemeal.
And Mike, do you think the UK today is prepared for a nuclear attack?
What do I think? Are we prepared? Well, obviously the government, if they take emergency powers, could take bunkers such as this back if they needed to. Probably not for the level it was before, but certainly at maybe a county borough level they could do so. I think we're prepared as all wars start. As they do, we've only got limited facilities. We are a small little island that punches above our weight, as we've always done, and I think we're doing our best to prevent another war. And it would be very, very silly if we had another war.
I hope you're right.
I don't think we're prepared for a nuclear attack in the future. I don't think we're prepared now, and I don't think we were prepared during the Cold War either. Simply because a nuclear war is so overwhelming, so horrific, so gargantuan that you can't prepare for that. There is no little plan that a civil servant can scratch out on some paper that will meet that challenge. In terms of alerting the public, the government are tinkering with a text message alert system, but I know that if my phone beeped just now and I picked it up and it said missile incoming, take cover, I would think I've been hacked. I think these days with social media and with the internet and with things being able to be hacked and changed, people wouldn't believe the warning unless it was a siren, but we don't have them any longer. So there's no way to alert the population to a nuclear war that's foolproof and reliable except the flash. And by then it's too late.
Nowadays, nuclear bunkers are Cold War relics, frozen in time from an age where we prepared to outlive the end of the world. Tourist attractions where the word secret is there to grab your attention. Should we be more prepared? Were the events of 1945 a full stop, never to be repeated, or simply a pause? Reflecting on his legacy as father of the atomic bomb in a 1965 documentary, Oppenheimer had this to say: "A few people laughed, a few people cried. Most people were silent."
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.